Hello and welcome back to the Road to 2000. My name is 2020 Metro Class Champion Caleb Denby, and today I will be your driver on this journey. Of course, I'm referring to the Metro Class Championship, which just took place at the club. Somehow, none of these SLU and Webster GMs made it out for the day, so they gave one to me finally. Sick of these college kids coming in and taking away all the titles. So today I actually wanted to look at a couple games from that tournament and one game from a tournament a while ago. And I wanted to go over how you should kind of be analyzing your own games, what kind of process you can go through to analyze your own games and to try and improve from them. Whether or not you won or lost, there's always going to be mistakes, there's always going to be room for improvement, unless you're playing like the game of your life. So just jumping into it here, in round one, I was paired against Alex Zhang, who is a very talented kid from the St. Louis area. I think he's part of the select chess program that we started here for talented kids. He's over 2000s and he's quite young, so give him a couple years, I'm sure he'll be beating me. But he was my opponent for round one, and he played the Ragozin. So knight c3, I am black in this game, bishop b4. And then there's a few lines here for white. You can play bishop g5. You can play something simple like e3, or queen a4 is also a very valid choice. Now, queen a4, usually this is not the way you want to play the opening, getting the queen out early. But today, here this is a special circumstance. So of course, this is a fork of the king and the bishop. And after knight c6, maybe black isn't quite ready to have this knight here. Does anybody know why black might not be ready to have this knight on c6?
You want to be able to do c5 to challenge the d4 square.
Yeah, it's exactly right. Just as a general rule, generally you want to develop your knights behind your pawns, because they do really well at controlling the same squares and putting a lot of pressure on the enemy position. And after queen a4, knight c6, obviously you can't develop the knight behind the pawn. That being said, this isn't all bad for black, in fact, because white does spend some time bringing this queen out to a4, and black does use that time to get developed. While it might not be the most ideal setup for black, the knight on c6 is still going to be a powerful piece. In particular, while the pressure on d4 is a little bit lessened because we can't play c5, we now are controlling e5 that much more quickly, thanks to this queen a4 move. And so be on the lookout. Sometimes these dark squares in the center kind of fall to black if white isn't careful. Now white played bishop g5, and I'm going to be honest with you, I've been slacking a bit on my opening theory study, and I didn't know this position. I had no idea what was happening. But fear not. That's why, if you've seen the lecture, don't memorize moves, understand your openings. You should be fine here. And so I know a very common idea in the Ragozin is to play h6 and force this bishop to make a decision. And a lot of the simpler lines come after bishop takes f6 and queen takes f6 when a pair of pieces come off the board, black gets castled, and then black plays for e5. And so this is kind of the way I was expecting this game to go. And then my opponent kind of surprised me with bishop f4. And I didn't really understand why my opponent had played like this. I thought h6 would be a useful move for me, and if he wanted to come to f4, he could have done it on the previous turn. And so I was sitting here for a little bit, and I was thinking about the position, because this was a totally fresh position to me. Turns out this is a totally fresh position to the Lee Chess database as well. So it's definitely worth stopping to take time in positions like these. So let's stop and think for a little bit. If you've never seen the Ragozin, it might be hard to come up with the idea that I came up with in the game. If you are quite familiar with the Ragozin, you might be a little bit more likely to find the sequence of moves that I played. But I thought white wasted quite a bit of time with bishop g5 to f4, and he wasted some time with queen a4 as well. And so I looked to find some ways to take advantage of that. So I'll give you guys a minute to think about it. So I was slacking here, didn't have the YouTube chat open, so we're gonna pull that up See what they have to say. Okay.
You got two moves. Like
I got 2 moves? What do you mean? What moves?
castling or moving your bishop to d7. Castling probably makes sense to work that pin out.
Yeah, okay. So black could castle here, and you would be unpinning the knight. But due to the way my opponent has played, he does have control over this e5 square. So if I just simply castle, we'll probably just develop with e3. And it's going to be a little bit tougher for me to get e5 through, because both of his pieces are aimed at this square, as well as the d-pawn, of course. Bishop d7 is not a bad move at all, but you kind of need a reason behind this play. And it turns out already on move, let's see what move it is, 7, there were some very interesting tactics going on. D takes c5 is being suggested. I think they mean d takes c4. And I actually don't like this move so much.
You could double his pawn.
So yeah, maybe d takes c4 is okay, but this wasn't the idea I was thinking of. Probably white can just play e3 and get this pawn back without too much difficulty. And once again, it's going to be tough to challenge the center with e5. So the move I did play is actually bishop d7, and my opponent played queen c2, which is kind of wasting more time. Of course, after e3, everybody loves this tactic. Does everybody see the tactic here? Everybody's favorite tactic. Take d4, hanging your bishop,
But you fought.
but you get the fork, yeah. So this is the big idea with bishop d7, is it does make a threat here. And so after queen c2, I actually had this line prepared before I played bishop d7, but now this is kind of the point of my play. So once again, let's see if you guys can find the idea. It's not something simple like castles. I think black is okay after castles, but this control over the e5 square is actually going to be a little bit unpleasant, I think.
94.
Yeah, knight e4, it's a playable move, but once again, white's just gonna develop. There's not too much of a threat here.
Great. Okay. So
Yeah.
you're looking for something a little more.
Doubling these pawns doesn't really get the job done, because this pawn's gonna trade itself off on d5.
Knight h5 to make the
Knight h5?
yeah, the bishop move around.
Yeah, that's close. That's a good idea. So if you play knight h5, probably bishop g3 or bishop e5. I'm not sure which one is better.
You're not gonna do an A.
Maybe bishop
move,
e5.
you go G5 like I.
And yeah, so takes, and this knight is going to be powerful here, and probably we have to spend some time bringing the knight back. But Michael Abram, with the correct answer, I played g5 in this position. And you'll see this happen sometimes in the Ragozin.
That's an Abram move.
And yeah, the reason I play g5 here is, 1, yes, you get to harass the bishop, and 2, if the bishop comes back to g3 trying to just kind of save itself, you're going to hit with g4, and then this pawn is actually still underdefended on d4. So g5 is a very forcing move, and while it's kind of unnatural, it's still worth thinking about the forcing moves even early on. And it turns out g5 was actually correct here. The bishop comes to e5, of course, to defend this pawn. And now the line I had calculated went g4, moves the knight, of course. You cannot really take on f6. I'll take back and take d4. So knight d2. I now take on e5, takes on e5. And then what's the big point at the end of the line? If you don't play this move, you're going to be significantly worse.
But is this where you do bishop captures knight and then you bring your knight in?
Well, you don't have quite enough defense of that square yet. Even if you take off this piece, then, I mean, even pawn takes could be playable. I think pawn takes might be played.
d4.
Yeah, d4 is exactly right.
Yeah.
So this is kind of the point. At the end of the day, you have the bishop pair, and while white does have this advanced pawn on e5, you have this advanced pawn on d4, and it's actually quite awkward to move this knight anywhere. You're not gonna, you definitely don't really want to come to e4. I'm simply going to capture this. This is pinned, so you have to take back with the queen. And now there's all sorts of uncomfortable business happening, even after, for example, queen g5 and something like queenside castles. You're getting a little bit killed here on the d2 square.
I like this.
So knight e4, not really going to be ideal for white. And so my opponent played knight d1, kind of stepping back. Now, of course, my knight is attacked, so I played knight h5. And the difficulty here is kind of evaluating whether or not all of this was worth it for black or not. You know, just because you can doesn't mean you should. So what do you think? Was all this worth it in the end for the black player here? What do we have in this position?
I think so. I think you probably could put your bishop on, what am I trying to say, C6 and then
Yeah.
castle queen side. You know.
Yeah,
And
that's
that would be solid. What's he gonna do to you?
it's kind of true. I think it was worth it for black as well. You were mentioning, you know, you could put the bishop on c6, maybe castle queenside. The point in this position that I want to talk about, obviously, both sides have glaring weaknesses. Both sides have crazy pawn structures.
Right.
But at the end of the day, white's pieces are bad, and black's pieces have squares, right? This
Right.
bishop on b4 is eyeing this knight. It'll probably get kicked away, but it can drop back to e7.
Right.
This bishop can come to c6, and this knight's threatening to come to f4.
White's bishop.
Yeah, and so if, for example, white wants to stop the knight from coming to f4, we even have the f5 square as well for the knight. So black's pieces have squares, and white's pieces kind of don't for the moment. You know, this e4 square might become a good asset for white, but for the moment, he doesn't really have any squares. In the game, my opponent played e3, which I think was a bit of a mistake, actually. White probably had to attack this bishop right away, undo this pin, and start trying to get this knight into e4. Instead, though, e3, and now this gives me a little bit of time to work things out. Black has a variety of moves here that are all very good. I chose bishop c6. Like you were saying, it just puts the bishop on a nice square, with the added bonus of allowing this queen to eye the d4 pawn as well. Now a3 from my opponent, and when I was looking at this game afterwards, the engine actually recommended I captured on d2, but I looked at it and looked at it and looked at it, and I'm never gonna take on d2 here, so I can't in good conscience. I felt like, you know, I should let you know that bishop takes d2 is what they're claiming to be the best move, but it's pretty unnatural, actually, to give up the bishop like this. The line might continue something like takes on e3, and then there's problems like knight f4, and this pawn is weak, and black is still more developed, but I liked bishop e7 a lot better instead. You just keep the bishop on the board, and you have plenty of opportunities to jump in to the attack.
Right.
b4 was my opponent's choice, and now is when you kind of have to stop and calculate here with black. So black has a number of options. The move that I chose was actually a little bit incorrect, but I'll let you try and find the winning line here. You do have a winning line. And it's actually not too complicated. I saw the line in the game, but I was worried about a particular response from white. That's what made me not play it. Although I suppose if I had no worries, then I would have just played it. So.
With F5?
F5 doesn't make a ton of sense. You're really asking for some trouble on the G6 square.
Well, yeah, I thought that's the only thing I didn't like about it. If you don't do it right, you can put your bishop up there. But you're right. So you got to do something a little. But, well, only thing I can kind of see is.
Do you take the E pawn?
Yeah, and then what's the idea? What if just knight takes?
Maybe bishop to G5?
Yeah, bishop G5 is actually a nice strengthening move here. But you just have a simple fork here, right? Everybody sees queen d4, attacks the rook, and attacks the pawn. The rook has to move, and now after queen takes e5, black is just up a pawn, and now these moves like f5 are actually going to be coming through without this e-pawn to kind of hinder the black pieces. Bishop g5 as well, and this knight's going to come under a lot of pressure. The move I was worried about, though, was I thought maybe my opponent could get away with f takes e here, guarding the d4 square. But of course, what is the response to f takes e?
The bishop comes and.
Yeah, bishop h4 check. And for some reason in my head, I thought g3 was playable here. But of course, you can simply take on g3 first, check, and then you get the rook in the end. So I, of course, should have just taken on e3 immediately. But, you know, I thought bishop h4, I'll pin this f pawn first, and then you can take e3 afterwards.
And then he probably hit you with g3.
Well, now, I mean, g3 has the same problem, and I actually noticed this time. What my opponent played, though, was actually the best response, and that was with b5. And I thought at first that he just kind of calculated badly, or maybe didn't calculate at all. That happens sometimes, too. But, of course, now this kind of lets me break through with my idea. I just take on e3. Taking on c6 is not going to be ideal for white. You're giving up this knight in return and losing a couple pawns, or at least one pawn in the exchange. So my opponent played knight takes e3, and then I played queen d4. And now, if you notice, it's the same threat, except now this knight is under attack as well, threatened to be captured. In the game, my opponent looked very defeated and gave up and played b takes c6, and I took on a1, and the game was over shortly. But once I played queen d4, I had a moment of panic where I was like, wait a second. He can just play the move that you all see. What move is that?
You mean if you take the rook?
No, instead of white taking the bishop here.
Instead of taking the bishop, he can move the rook. Let's see what can he move.
Well, if he moves the rook, I'll take the knight. I'm pinning the king. If only there were some move in chess that moves both the king and the rook at the same time.
Castle.
Yeah, so white can castle here. And black still has a nice advantage after bishop takes f2, renewing the threat to the knight. But takes, and it's definitely not the winning position that I thought I had.
Go back.
Yeah,
Not move. Yeah.
back to here.
Yeah. Knight b3.
So knight b3, of course, there are two threats in the position. One is this one, which you were solving with knight b3, but the other one is to take this knight using this pin. So knight b3, unfortunately, does lose the knight. But yeah, in the game, my opponent just took on c6. In the game, ended quickly. Of course, yeah, castling would have been the crazy save in the position for white here. What was the takeaway from this game, though? Well, for black, I guess the point is, black being me in this case, it's worth spending a bit more time calculating. Of course, laziness is actually a huge problem for a lot of chess players. And I don't mean laziness in like studying, you know, outside of the tournament, you know, getting well prepared for the tournament, doing tactics every day. Now, the kind of laziness I'm talking about is laziness at the board, which is something I've talked about a little bit. You get to the chessboard and you're playing your chess game, and you think you see a winning line, and then it's very tempting just to play it and see what happens. You know,
Instead of calculating.
yeah, or not calculating thoroughly enough even, and so it's just kind of a wake-up call that you really do need to spend the extra time to calculate, so you don't get surprised at the board after playing, you know, your winning line with queenside castles out of nowhere. It's not good to be missing these kinds of moves, and so that was, I think, my big mistake in the game, is not calculating well enough to notice queenside castles, and especially not calculating well enough in this position to realize I can just take here immediately. You know, queen d4 is unstoppable. And so, as always, even in games which you win, there are going to be mistakes, if only mistakes in your thinking, even if they don't appear on the board. And so you want to be pretty critical about that kind of thing, and keep an eye on it. Make sure you're doing everything you should be at the chessboard.
And then, like you said, don't give up, because he took the bishop thing, and it's just about over, but he could have castled. It's been a little better for him.
So from Black's point of view, yeah, the only problem I really saw with this game is being a bit too lazy at the board. With White, on the other hand, there are a few things to keep an eye on. One is, you know, if you don't know the opening super well, you really just need to rely on those principles. So bishop g5 and moving the bishop back, already this is what gives Black this nice little edge that we saw in the game, where he can push on the king side with g5 and g4, and then get this big central d4 pawn that really cramps White. So that was mistake number one. And then I think from there, once he kind of had this bad position, he kind of just crumbled. And it's really, really annoying to try to play bad positions like this, but if you're gonna, you know, score those extra half points in your tournaments, if you're really, you know, caring about each and every half point that you get, this is a position where if I had the white pieces, I would spend a crazy amount of time here, just thinking, looking at all the options, trying to find some way to create problems for my opponent. And e3 definitely isn't that move. In fact, I think my opponent played e3 rather quickly. So when you find yourself on the back foot like this is when you need to kind of double down and try and find the absolute best way to cause problems for your opponent. Even if you're not playing the best moves, you want to play problematic moves, moves that give your opponent the chance to slip up a little bit.
Like last year.
So yeah, a3, and then at the end of the day, yeah, the final mistake is kind of this b5 move without calculating. And then, of course, after queen d4, taking the bishop instead of queenside castles. Just once again, I think there's just some reluctance to put in the maximum effort in what he assumed was a losing position. Any questions on this game with Alex here? All right. Well.
I think that though, when he made E3, he realized he's getting behind in development, so he's trying to make up for it. But
Yeah, but when you're in such a bad position like this, you can't play just the natural move intuitively, because when you're so far behind in development in space that you need to be developing absolutely correctly rather than just developing at all.
yeah.
You know, I like to say sometimes, well, White hasn't done anything wrong, so White can't be worse. But White has done a lot wrong already, so you can no longer just simply develop to maintain some kind of balance.
The opening time is the most important thing.
So yeah, we're moving on here to game 2 of the Metro Class Championship. I was playing a local guy by the name of Isaiah Gadson. I've actually known Isaiah for quite some time. Not super well, but I think he was playing Scholastic tournaments at the same time I was, all the way back in 5th grade. So we've both been doing this for a while. The game against Isaiah went d4, g6, c4, bishop g7, and then just a quick note about the opening. Knight c3 is a perfectly fine move, but sometimes people do this annoying thing with c5 and bishop takes c3, and I've never bothered to figure out what I'm supposed to do here. It's supposed to be good for White, but I've just never bothered to figure it out. So I play knight f3 on move 3 against this move order. Knight f6. Now I play knight c3. The diagonal's blocked, so I'm not worried about that line anymore. d6, e4, castles, bishop e2, e5, castles, and now knight bd7, which looks like the fourth most popular line in the King's Indian here. Of course, the main line goes with knight c6 and d5 and knight e7, and then, you know, white does this and black does this, and white gets checkmated, but he's up a rook, so he gets to feel good about it. But in the game, knight bd7. And so this is a line I knew a little bit about. I wasn't 100% certain of all of the theory. I knew that bishop e3 was a move. I knew that rook e1 was a move. I thought queen c2 might be a move, but I wasn't sure. And I knew that d5 was kind of bad, so I wasn't going to play that one. But I just chose bishop e3 in the game. Now my opponent played knight g4. I knew that the idea after knight g4 was to play bishop g5. And after f6, I had some vague idea that you could come back to any of these three squares. I chose d2, not knowing it was like the main line. My opponent played knight h6. And now this is really where I paused to think for a while. Let's try and come up with some ways to play for white here. First and foremost, though, I want to talk a little bit about bishop d2 before you make any decisions here. Why the d2 square for the bishop? It seems like the worst of the three options, right? You kind of block in your queen. Your knight can no longer use this square. Why put this bishop on such a stupid-looking square?
Because you can put the queen behind it for a battery?
Not so much. Queen c1 isn't really my idea here with bishop d2. Not so much. For example, immediately, I'll just say, knight f7 is what my opponent wants to play anyways, supporting the center.
Oh, okay. Because I thought you would have played h3, so when you bishop into e3, you could stay there.
Are you dreaming of some type of attack on the c pawn?
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
Some type of attack on the c pawn?
This c-pawn?
40 moves later or something?
I'm confused. Oh, you're talking about having this. No, not quite that. Well, let's examine first the downsides to bishop c1, because to my eyes, this is actually the most natural move, bringing the bishop all the way back. But the downside is that, okay, let's say, just for example, knight back to h6 is played again, and now you play a move like d5. Yeah, let's say d5, and let's say a move like a5. You play a3, knight c5. You can't play b4 here. This is a huge downside to bishop c1. You cannot play b4 here because this is now a pin. The bishop's in the way. And I think this is the main reason why bishop d2 is the main move. You just interfere with your own pieces like this. And this turns out to be very, very relevant. So in the game, I wanted to make use of the fact that I had not put the bishop back on c1. So I took on c5, took on e5 rather. My opponent took on e5, and then what move do you think I played here? Taking advantage of the fact that my bishop's on d2 and not c1. So yeah, knight d5 is actually a key idea in the position for white. And you can bring this bishop out to b4 to look at some of these dark squares. But the problem with knight d5 is black has a distinct advantage in the pawn structure, actually. Of course, white has committed to both e4 and c4, but black is only committed to e5. So he still has this option of c6 remaining. And this is actually kind of the crux of black's play, is black's trying to say, you don't have the d5 square, and I do have the d4 square. This is what black is trying to prove. So knight d5, you're going to get hit with c6, unfortunately. But the move I played, taking advantage of the fact the bishop is out here, is actually b4. And now let's examine what the difference would be, just to back up one more time. If I played bishop c1 in the same line, and I played b4 here, what would black's response be? Black has a very good move here. No. Remember, what's the problem with the bishop on c1? It interferes. It interferes, right? So black can take advantage of this. Yeah, it's a5. Of course, you can't play a3 due to the pin. And so you have to play an awkward-looking move like either b5 or even bishop a3. And now the problem is you're giving up the c5 square. This is what the move b4 is aimed at attaining. The move b4 wants to take the b5 square, and you're going to give it up if you give up this b4 pawn. And so in the game line, after bishop d2, knight h6 takes b4. Now against a5, I of course will just be playing a3 immediately. You know, I'm not against playing this position at all, where black is actually the one giving up the a file. So b4 is the big point to my opening play here. The bishop on d2 supports this idea. And this is the type of logical chess that you want to kind of strive for. It helps to already know some of these ideas going in. It's tough to kind of divine these at the board sometimes, but just take note of where you've put your pieces and what the differences are between your various options, and then try to make the most effective use of it. So this knight comes back to f7. It's a pretty natural move. Guards the g5 square, guards e5, in preparation for a move like f5 later on. And now I simply continued gaining space on the queen side with c5. My opponent played c6, putting an end to my knight d5 ideas. This queen comes out to b3. It's natural to get the queen off the open file, and this supports the queen side push as well. Queen e7 by my opponent, and now I simply play bishop e3, guarding this pawn a little bit more thoroughly. Rook d8, rook d1, and now knight f8 is my opponent's play. I took advantage of this open d file that my opponent kind of gave me. Of course, though, I do want to mention black is still sticking to this plan. Black wants to put the knight on e6 and the knight on d4, and also perhaps develop this bishop out to e6 as well. In the meantime, I simply take on d8, rook d1, queen e7. And now, let's see if you guys can find the next key move for white here. This is kind of what the play has been culminating in. If you'll notice, all of my previous moves have been bringing pieces towards this queen side. So yeah, b5 is actually totally right. You can't really just get complete control over this square, because black's not going to take on b5. That'd be a little bit foolish. What black did do in the game is get the bishop developed, so I moved the queen, and now knight d8 to defend on c6. And now, of course, I simply take on c6 to gain a long-term structural advantage. And now in the game, I was looking at my position. I was feeling pretty good about myself here. It looks like white just has slightly more space on this queen side, and I was hoping that I could prove a pretty distinct advantage with that. Turns out, though, black isn't doing totally horribly here. For example, in the game I just played knight d2. Rerouting the final piece over to this queen side. Now he played knight d7, and I suddenly noticed that, hang on a second, that's one attacker, that's two attackers, this is going to be three attackers, this is going to be four attackers. He's actually quite well placed to challenge the c5 pawn. For the immediate moment, I simply defended it, and then he added another attacker with bishop f8. So bishop f8, of course, putting more pressure onto this pawn. He's still not threatening to capture it immediately, but perhaps if I do nothing, he's threatening to take here. And now there are simply three attackers here. If knight a4, actually maybe rook b8, and knight b7. And oh my goodness, so many attackers, I don't want to count. So after bishop f8, let's see if you guys can come up with the move that I played here. Can you come up with the move? I don't think the line I just showed was quite the most accurate for black, by the way, but we'll roll with it here. You get the general idea. Black's trying to put a ton of pressure on this pawn, and he's hoping that I will crumble. Rook d6? Yeah, rook d6 is actually a pretty good move. It keeps up the edge a little bit. Probably queen e8 is a problem you have to solve here. Just keeping an eye on all the pieces. Black's position is nothing if not compact. But yeah, rook d6 isn't a bad move at all. You could probably end up just repeating, or maybe trying to claim you slightly improved the position of your rook somehow, or maybe even go for like an exchange sacrifice with some crazy business like this. It's not so easy though when you're at the board. You don't want to just give away these rooks. They matter to you. Let's see, YouTube chat. No good ideas from the YouTube chat. Somebody in YouTube wants to play bishop c4. What do you guys think about bishop c4? You hate it. I hate it too. Good job. You don't want to trade off pieces when your opponent's behind in space. It just makes their position easier to play. Black could take, play knight e6, and you're just improving his attack.
Instead of taking, could you just take the pawn and oh no, I forgot about bishop.
Yeah, he does have three attackers, but the queen is a little bit awkwardly placed to take on c5. Knight a5. Well, this one does give up this pawn, and I'm not so sure we're thrilled about this development here. I don't see myself winning this chess game very easily, especially because a2 hangs. But okay. Knight a5, not a horrible idea. Not a horrible idea. Putting more pressure. All right, I'll change the question, and maybe then you'll find the move. Instead of trying to find white to move and defend the c-pawn, try to find white to move and win. White to move and win. To punish black's lack of space. Yeah, someone in YouTube has it. Someone in YouTube. Good job, Lewis. Of course, I'm sure he's done all the necessary calculation for it too. F4 is a little bit beside the point here. The play is revolving around this kind of tension between these pawns in particular, not so much around this e pawn. Queen a3 defends a pawn, but doesn't win. We're trying to win the game. Anybody?
By when do you mean check?
No, well, maybe losing pieces. Just, you're achieving a winning position here. There's one move that it's like +4 for white. Don't fact check me. Everybody in YouTube has it now that I literally told them.
With knight to a5 and you gonna hit that pawn.
I just talked about knight a5, Michael. You takes here. You takes here. Knight d5, Tristan. You get the gold star. Knight d5, losing a piece. Everybody loves losing pieces, so it's the best type of winning move. So black takes on d5, and now I resign. But no, what do I do here? Simply recapture, right? You take back, and you have fewer knights, but now you have more pawns. So that's the good news. If a simple move like bishop f7, then I think most things are winning here. Particularly, you can start with c6 or d6. Let's just start with d6. And these pawns are just kind of crashing through. Let's look at the more testing line, which is bishop f5. Now, there's one move here that keeps the total win in the position. You're absolutely winning if you play this move. In fact, I did not play this move. See, I'm not perfect. So there's only one way to keep the win. And if you'll notice, it's the best move to kind of displace the black pieces. That's your goal here. You're claiming that these two pawns are worth the knight because you're making the black pieces so awkward and you're taking away so many squares from them that you're just going to be able to push them through to win. So it's kind of sensible, this next move, if you kind of approach it with that thinking. You want to displace the black pieces as much as you can.
C6.
So c6, not a bad idea, but it doesn't displace the black pieces as much as you can. Let's see, what was I thinking after c6 though? It's a valid point. I think simply knight b. No, I think you have to take this. You can play pawn takes, and now knight b8, I believe. And we're putting a little bit of pressure here. Although, wait a second, this looks awful. This looks terrible. Okay, I don't remember what's wrong with c6. Ah, okay. What about queen b4 after c6? This was what I was worried about in the game. Of course, you can trade queens. You can even push c7 or take this knight. But at the end of the day, remember, you only have a pawn for the piece that you lost. And so here you do have this strong d-pawn and maybe a slight edge, and maybe more than a slight edge, but black is kind of surviving. Black is surviving.
G4?
Tristan, 2 gold stars and 1 knight. G4. This bishop is the key piece for black defending this queening diagonal. And so after g4, of course, this bishop has to move, and it can't go to e6, can't go to these squares, so it has to go to c2. And then the nice follow-up for white takes advantage of this king as well, and you play d6. Now, the most natural move is actually queen e8 to keep an eye on the squares in front of the pawns. But queen e8, of course, loses now to queen c4 check. And so queen f7 would be forced. And now something like bishop c6 even further misplaces these black pieces, putting more things on this diagonal. Now simply rook d2. You really can't take this knight, otherwise this is just dead. And so maybe bishop e4, and now c6. And all of these black pieces are just kind of tripping over themselves, and this is just completely crushing for white. What I played in the game is actually d6, hitting the queen first, and now after queen e8, g4 is obviously less good because of bishop e6, when now instead of white getting this diagonal, black gets the diagonal. So g4 would have been really, really nice, but I played d6 instead. Now bishop b5 was my choice, just putting more pressure on this diagonal. Knight f7, trying to reroute and put pressure on the d6 pawn. I simply continued with c6. And now my opponent could have taken, I would have taken here, and that was one way to play. Instead, Isaiah chose knight b6, when after takes on b6, takes on b6, I can play d7 and kind of win a piece in this manner. Of course, if you play queen d8, you'll get hit with c7, and this rook is going to die. Going to die. So instead, simply bishop takes d7, pawn takes d7, and queen d8. And turns out this position is only like +2, so I'm the worst ever. Missed my chance with g4. Now I'm just playing for this nice d pawn here. Of course, my queen's attacked, so I played queen e4, removing it from the threat of capture. King g7 was a very nice move by my opponent, just stepping off of this annoying diagonal that was the source of so many problems for him. I played queen d5, just trying to kind of weasel my way in here, create some threats. Knight d6 attacks my bishop, so I move it. Rook b8. It's actually pretty important for black to stay on this back rank here, otherwise you're going to run into some tactics with queen e6 when this knight's gonna be attacked, and queen e8 might be coming as well. Dangerous stuff, dangerous stuff. So rook b8 keeps the back rank a little bit more solid. I played a4 with the idea being I need to get the knight into the game, and this pawn's in the way, so I'm going to kill it. My opponent played knight f7 back, which is actually a really nice defensive move. He kept playing like these moves that were like surprising and good. Knight f7 allows this queen some mobility by guarding this d8 square. I continued with knight d2, trying to get the knight into a better square. Queen e7 was his choice, and I played knight c4. And now, after queen c5, I kind of started to let things slip a bit. I played rook b1, and it turns out knight c4 probably wasn't the greatest move ever. Probably rook b1 immediately. And then I have all the same threats, except it's coming through a bit more quickly. I haven't spent the time to play this move, knight c4. And we'll kind of actually see that happen in the game. So in the game, I played rook b1 here. Knight d8 attacks my bishop, so I trade queens and play bishop d5. And now my big idea is to break through with a5. This was kind of my winning try. And it turns out if I had just played rook b1 here, now after queen c5 takes, I can play a5 immediately. So this is why my play was a little bit inaccurate here. I missed a chance to just kind of break through with this immediately. Of course, we saw knight c4 instead. And now if I play a5 here, do you guys, oh, well, I'm sorry, my bishop's hanging. King f8. And now if I play a5 here, how do you think black would respond? There's only one way for black to respond. All other moves lose. Yeah, b5 is the key idea. You need this bishop to defend this a7 square. Otherwise, you're just gonna get killed. This pawn just runs. So with that in mind, I played the move rook b5, making b5 illegal. King e7 was played. Now a5. Thankfully, b5 is still illegal. So king takes d7. And my original idea was to play a6 here, but I found out that my opponent is just in time with the move knight c6. And this was really annoying to me because I wanted to win. And knight c6 makes it hard to win. He's going to put this knight on a7, and it's going to be really difficult to get any further with my a-pawn. So I kind of switched up tactics here. Turns out, well, first of all, at this point, my opponent was in pretty severe time pressure. And I wasn't in super severe time pressure, but I was running out of time. I played the move knight takes b6, trying to just play with an advanced b pawn and a bishop against a knight. Turns out the only way to keep an edge is to take with the pawn, keeping more pieces on the board, which is kind of in line with keeping winning chances alive sometimes. Instead, though, knight takes b6, bishop takes, pawn takes, and I thought maybe I had like just a total hold on the position. All my pieces kind of defend each other, and there was no way for black to really get at this pawn. Fortunately, I was wrong. My opponent very quickly played knight b7. I played g4, which is always a kind of a good move in these types of endgames. You want to take some space and keep the kingside pawns a little bit stuck for the moment. And it actually came into play a little bit later on. Now knight d6 from my opponent, simply rook b4. Now knight c8, and this was his big maneuver. In 3 short moves, he's already attacking my pawn. So I play b7 to defend it. The knight comes back to d6. And then I realized that I have no way to defend this pawn after king c7. So I played rook b6, king c7. I gave well, I could have given the check, but he would have simply repeated. And so instead, I played the move rook a6. And my idea was I'm going to take on f6 if you take on b7 and try to win this position. Turns out this is a very, very slight edge for white due to how these pawns are kind of disjointed here, although black should be holding without too much difficulty. Instead, though, my opponent was afraid of me, so he played rook f8, defending this pawn. And I said, oh my god, thank god he played rook f8. Now I can try to win. And so I'll ask you to try and find the winning idea here from this position. It's kind of difficult. It's kind of difficult. There's only one way to really continue pressing for an advantage. It's a difficult idea, but I'll let you try and find it. Just a few minutes. I'm seeing a lot of rook a7s, a lot of rook a8s in the YouTube chat. One rook c6 check, one rook a1. It's not rook a8 because of rook b8. Everybody wants to play rook a8. One person really wants to play rook c6 check, but he has no idea why. So of course, rook a8, black is playing rook b8 in response to keep white from queening. Now 2 people want to check him, but they still don't know why. Does rook c6 do nothing? Well, if it does something, you got to tell me what. You got to tell me what. So,
I was like,
yeah.
Rook c6 doesn't just make it harder for him to defend the d8 square.
Well, okay, I'll play king d7.
Yeah, if he moves the king away, and then the rook cuts him off.
Sure, but your pawn's hanging. Rook c6, king d7, your pawn's hanging, right? So you have to do something about
Yeah,
it.
I was thinking move the rook. Oh, never mind.
Move the rook,
Yeah, move it back.
back to a6. I offer a draw.
No, I meant down.
How far down? My goodness. Okay. All right. First hint, rook c6 is correct. Rook c6 is correct. But what's the idea? So yeah, of course I will mention the obvious tactic. If you take on b7, then the knight hangs. So king d7 instead. Rook c6, king d7, bishop e6 check. Hanging all the pieces. I didn't see that one. If it were illegal for black to take the white pieces, bishop e6 would be really, really powerful. All right. I'll give you a hint. Attack this pawn. The hints are flowing. It's only a matter of time now. It's only a matter of time. Rook c8 hangs your rook and your pawn. Come on, you guys are better than this.
But I thought when the rook was on a6, he could go down to a8.
Well, we looked at that, Michael. We looked rook a8, rook b8 was the response.
Oh, b8. Oh, I didn't get it.
Nobody knows? Nobody knows how to attack an h-pawn? The move, of course, is rook c3 with an idea. In the game, my opponent played rook b8, which loses to rook h3. Now the point is, if you want to capture this guy, you're going to get hit with rook h7, and there are a number of ways to play here. Perhaps simplest is just taking. And uh-oh. Everybody knows the triangle? He's outside the box.
The square, move the square.
Yep. And so white is simply winning king and pawn endgame. So you can't take the pawn. You can't play something like h5, because I'll simply take it. And after takes and takes, you have the same problem with this h-pawn. And after, if you don't take on b7, then, I mean, this is going to be so sad. This is going to be so sad. You can't stop both pawns, and you're never really threatening to take b7 anymore, because white has this nice h-pawn, which is passed. So in the game, my opponent tried rook h8. Does everybody see the move after rook h8 to end the game? I played this move and black resigned.
Rook captures
H7.
You got it. Rook takes h7, and black resigns here. And you can't take the rook. White will simply queen, and this is over. And if you, I mean, obviously, the rook itself is hanging as well. So rook takes h7 was the end of this game. So this one had a lot of ups and downs in it, but this knight d5 move is a really nice idea. Hopefully you get a chance to play a move like that in one of your games. I'd like to say I just totally invented it over the board, but I think I had seen some kind of similar idea in some famous game. I have no idea which one or when, but it wasn't totally new to me. But it's definitely one to keep in mind. If you can get this fluid pawn center kind of rolling up the board, it's worth quite a lot. The main danger, as what you saw happen in the game, is that by giving up a full piece for a pawn like this, a lot of the time your opponent can just give it back in a pretty nice manner. Like bishop takes d7, pawn takes d7. And I still had a nice advantage, probably should have been winning, but it's a lot more difficult than it feels like it should be. So always be wary of your opponent giving the material back is kind of what happened in this game. Any questions on this game? All right, well, I think that just about does it for the Road to 2000 tonight. Just a quick recap of the key ideas. Don't be lazy at the board. Calculate to completion. It's really, really important. And that's a very common mistake quite often, is just not calculating to the end, not because you can't, but sometimes because you don't want to. So be on the lookout for that in your games. And then in this game as well, a lot of key ideas revolving around using extra space. You know, don't trade off pieces, and then look for this nice breakthrough. Look for ways to make your opponent's pieces less coordinated. All right, with that, thank you very much for joining me this week on the Road to 2000. My name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.